Okay, welcome to everyone joining here at Midgard Base Camp in Fossvollur, Iceland, and welcome to everyone online here to join us for our green program capstones for the first summer program of the year. Over the last 8 days, these greenies, these green program students, have been studying renewable energy and innovation here in Iceland. They've put their lessons that they've learned here in class to practice through facility tours and events and activities throughout Iceland, learning about nature, learning about the impacts of climate change, and studying some of the renewable energy here in this wonderful country that we've all come to know and love. So basically today we're going to have about 15 minutes for each group to present. There will be 5 to 10 minutes of question and answers. Anyone online, please feel free to join us in asking questions to these teams. And the purpose of this capstone is to use these lessons they've learned in Iceland in clean energy and sustainability to create an entrepreneurial solution to a sustainable development challenge targeting the UN's sustainable development goals to create a better future based on the students' passions, ideas, and innovations. So without further ado, I will let the first group come up and introduce themselves and then take the floor. So thank you.
Hello, everybody. We are a lobbying group, and our campaign is People for Greener Transit. My name is Austin Wand.
My name is Renee Ristias.
I'm Asha Edmondson.
I'm Mike Bond.
I'm Leonardo Garavito.
I'm Jared Peters. So for our green, so we had to create a green circle, which was why, how, and what. So for the why, it was to reduce emissions and by reducing traffic in the Boston-New York corridor, and that would have the effect of lowering carbon emission and also making travel less from 4.5 hours to 1.5. The how was to develop a high-speed rail between the two major cities, and then the what is we would be a lobbying group for SDGs, which Renee will further reinforce.
So the problem that we are looking to solve is, so there are several cities that are kind of close together. You don't necessarily want to take an airplane to them, but it is quite a long car drive, and you often have to travel between each city. And unfortunately, like the millions of people that travel between these cities every year, they either take a plane or a car, and that emits a lot of CO2. And so the place that we're focusing on is New York City and Boston. And then also, the increased cost of living has pushed several people outside of these major cities into like smaller cities or suburbs, and that means that they have to commute to work every day. And this also increases CO2 emissions. And then the cost and time of present transportation methods is very high, so plane tickets can be very expensive, gas prices are increasing, and then also for New York and Boston, for example, it can take up to 4 hours at minimum to travel between the two cities. And then lastly, increasing CO2 emissions is producing poor air quality for local residents and is only increasing climate change.
So here we have a proposed route for this high-speed rail by the North Atlantic Rail Initiative, running from Boston to New York City with some stops in the bigger cities along the way. Most of this route is already on existing infrastructure. There would have to be a few reroutes and rail upgrades, as well as building a new tunnel. But for the most part, this all already exists. It's just a matter of bringing the rails up to a standard of high speed.
So the line on the previous slide through the New York-Boston corridor will be kind of a pilot project to prove the viability and the benefit of a high-speed and pollution-free rail. Above, we see similar locations throughout the U.S. where the same infrastructure improvements could be implemented in we could be reducing the transit times and reducing emissions, which consequently improves the quality of life for all the residents, which we can really implement in multiple areas, being that our project will work and be implemented correctly.
Through our work, we'll be focused on 4 different sustainable development goals. The first one being industry, innovation, and infrastructure. We'll accomplish this goal by utilizing pre-existing infrastructure, such as highways and currently existing railways, to create this bullet train on, and we're also making sure that this train will be run entirely on green hydrogen. We also want to reduce inequalities by providing better access to public transport for marginalized communities, especially in the suburbs, which does not necessarily have the same access to public transit as the city would. And we're working on sustainable cities and communities by taking steps towards creating a people-centered city rather than one that is centered around cars. And through our time in Iceland, we've also realized that sustainability can really be ingrained into a culture. And we're hoping that by creating a bullet train project and encouraging people to take greener transit, that this will help work towards that. And we'll also work on climate action by reducing the carbon footprint of commuters in the Boston and New York corridor with a train run entirely on green hydrogen.
So our resources are going to be primarily through public outreach, convincing people that they should be using these trains and that they're going to be worth it. This will help us push for local governments to back the use of the trains over personal vehicles. We'll also be seeking out donations from the public to our group in order to make campaign contributions to pro-high-speed rail candidates.
So the main types of intervention that we're looking at is by lobbying federal, state, and local governments to invest and sponsor high-speed rail projects. At first, we'd start with just lawmakers in Boston and New York area. However, if this expands, it would be a more national endeavor. And then we also want to engage with local communities to build public support and make sure that the train meets their needs and their wants for how they want to run their community, and make sure that it is not further marginalizing groups that have been historically marginalized. And lastly, we also want to support pro-high-speed rail candidates in elections, so that way we can have governmental support for our plans.
Now to answer an important question, who will we be helping with this project? We'll be helping anyone who needs to travel the Boston and New York route. There will be trains every half an hour on the weekdays and every 1 hour on the weekends, so that it is really efficient and it makes people want to take the train. We will improve transit access to marginalized communities, which I will explain how we'll do that in a later slide. It's less costly for users as well because they no longer have to pay for gas, their car use, insurance, parking in these different cities, and tolls that they have to drive through. And the travel will also be faster as they can bypass all of the car traffic on the highways and the train. We'll also be helping the climate by lowering a carbon footprint with having fewer cars on the road, and that the fact that this project is run on hydrogen instead of fossil fuels. This is just to further illustrate our point of how we want to help marginalized communities that live outside the cities, more so in the suburbs. This graphic is of the New York area, and in blue it shows areas where the population is becoming increasingly consists of people of color. And we want to really make sure that these suburbs get equitable access to transit, as we know that this has not always been the case with the US and its history. And we will help by consulting with community leaders in New York and Boston with a plan for free hydrogen-powered buses to take users to the main stations. But obviously, our most important priorities are working with the plan that benefits the largest amount of people and the environment, and also listening to community leaders as they would better understand the needs of the community than we would from an outside perspective.
So there are 3 main current transit options that are available for people trying to travel from New York to Boston. So first of all, you have a plane. Those tickets usually range from about $120. And then once you include like all the time it takes to get to the airport, to get through security, to actually be on the plane, and to leave the airport, it's usually about 3.5 to 4 hours, even though it's only an hour flight. And then also the emissions are 135 kilograms of CO2 per passenger, which is a lot given that most of these planes carry upwards of 100 people. A car trip, depending on traffic, can at least take 4 hours, if not more. And with increasing gas prices, this $50 estimate is very low. And then also the emissions estimate is a very liberal estimate, and usually the CO2 emissions would be a lot higher than this 93 kilograms of CO2. And lastly, the existing train routes cost about $160 per ticket, and those can take about 4 hours as well. And the emissions are 71.5 kilograms of CO2 per passenger as well. So all of these options are fairly expensive, they take a lot of time, and they are very bad for the environment. So that brings us to our option. We plan on selling tickets for less than $50 per person. So that means that the tickets will be more affordable and more people will have the opportunity to ride these trains. And then the time will take an hour and a half, which is a lot shorter of a time than any of the other options. So you can reach your destinations quicker, and it makes it a more attractive option than any of the pre-existing options. And then also it is a completely emissions-free train. Green hydrogen makes sure that there's no CO2 in the atmosphere and that it is a completely renewable and sustainable option that will not further any negative climate change impacts.
So our proposal creates jobs, it decreases dependence on fossil fuels and reduces greenhouse gas emissions, which cause global warming. Importantly, it creates a convenient, cheap, and fast way of commuting into these cities for the 33 million people in New York, Boston, and all the suburbs in between them. And it allows lower-income individuals and families to access economic opportunities in these areas while allowing them to live in farther-out areas with lower costs of living.
So extremely important extremely important in any situation is the stakeholders. So who's going to be most affected? And we know that that's going to be the community members. And so we're going to make sure that we get the community involved and knowledgeable and push a solid PR campaign to ensure that they have it in their heads of what we're doing and make sure that it's what the community wants us to do. On top of that, we're going to ensure that we have our lawmakers we have our lawmakers joined up with us to make sure that they understand what is happening and that they're helping promote the idea as well, because if we can't get the lawmakers to join, then we're not moving forward with this.
There are several opposition groups that will have to work to get on board with our project. First is the auto and oil industry. They are currently very heavily lobbying in the government. So we need to convince lawmakers to step away from auto and oil and to work with a new, more sustainable option. Second would be climate change denialists. They might not see the benefits of trains. So that is why we would push the other benefits that our trains would bring, which would include cheaper options, shorter time commutes, and then also hopefully we can convince them that climate change is something real. And then lastly, we have those that would be concerned with the cost and impact on taxpayers. For this, we'd have to show the longevity and the long-term positive impacts of this train service and show that it would be more beneficial to invest in green and sustainable energy rather than relying on fossil fuels that could be used up in the next couple of decades.
Next will be the channels from which our lobbying group will reach the community. So community events such as the one in the lower right-hand corner, ads ducktailed with social media advertisement, donations from private individuals and organizations, and then most importantly, we'd be meeting with lawmakers and writing policy proposals for those lawmakers in order to advance our agenda.
So let's talk about making this project green. We want to go over the life cycle analysis. We understand what the difference between this and a normal train is, and it comes down to the hydrogen. So we're using green hydrogen, which means it's coming from renewable energy. It's not coming from any fossil fuel sources. So we're going to be utilizing hydrolysis from excess renewables, meaning solar or hydro or anything in the area, and based upon the city plans within the Boston-New York corridor, they do plan by 2030 to be fully renewable. On top of that, because it's hydrogen powered, we do not need to hang power lines going through the corridor where the train goes, which reduces the cost of construction, makes it more green in that sense, and then we're building on existing infrastructure. So all of those together create a much lower carbon impact on the environment when constructing and throughout the course of the utilization of the rail.
So the cost structure for our project, we would derive the most of the money from the federal government with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. We would also pressure politicians into diverting funds from the dying highways and put it into more efficient railway, and also private donors and corporate investment. That is something we're going to explain in our revenue section about how we plan to use the future profits from this project.
The cost of production, so there's a similar proposal from Boston to New York, which would be roughly $105 billion over 20 years. The Caltrain in California was roughly the same, and we looked at a Japanese train that was different, but it cost a little bunch. But we're hoping for about less than $100 billion proposal. And so the revenue, this will probably make a slight profit, looking at a similar French system. But this is mostly a public good, so there won't be much need for profitability. So as stated, we'll look for donations from like-minded individuals.
For the profits from this project, as we said in the last presentation, there is a little profit, not much. We're expecting to see between a 1% and 2% return of investment. So from what we get from this project, we're planning to invest it in like hedge funds that maybe invest in cleaner technologies and some more profitable investments. And from that return of capital, we're gonna use it to upgrade the current stations to renewables and help fund the project itself, so we're not so over-reliant on the federal government.
Those are our citations, and thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
Questions?
What? Yeah.
I do have a question. How are you going to basically tackle the issue of, this huge metropolitan area wanting to decarbonize through renewable energy? If you're going to assume that they have excess, which right now we know that they don't, have you looked into how much is going to actually have to be built extra to, for example, power or to fill up a train that may be running, up multiple times a day?
Yeah, I think Austin can handle this question.
Just remember to repeat it briefly.
Hello, the question was, how are we going to support the energy needs of the train to produce the hydrogen?
Correct?
Yes.
And so what we're planning on doing is we know that this is going to take a little while to build the actual infrastructure, and our timeline is in 2030 is when we're hopefully having the train constructed and finished. And by then, with all the localities having promises to go net zero carbon, at that time, we'll be able to utilize the energy from the existing power plants and use that towards our train.
Any other questions?
Students? Anybody in the audience?
So with this being so would this primarily be like a commuter train or like a vacation train? And going along with that, would you advertise it as a place to people could still do work while they're going to work, as opposed to driving? You can't do work while you're driving, kind of thing?
Yeah, Leonardo will answer that question.
So the inspiration for the project was based on the Japanese model of so your question was, is this a train for where you can work and go from city to city, or is it a vacation train or something like that? Okay, so we actually based ourselves in the Japanese model, where people, even though they live in different cities, they can work in other cities while taking the bullet train, the Shinkansen, as you saw. So it will be more of a, you know, a train that gives the people the opportunity to, you know, they don't want to live in New York because of the high cost of living or insecurity or something like that, but there is very good job opportunities. So maybe they can live in Boston or somewhere in the nearby vicinity that has access to this proto like trial we're doing. So yeah, it will be more of a work train. There's actually no purpose for the train, like as in vacations. It's just moving people. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Does that answer your question? All right.
So the train is likely to connect like big cities together for commuting. After establishing like the city-to-city connection, would you guys plan to branch out and have shuttles bring people from more residential areas to like a central hub, or?
Yeah. Renee will answer that question.
Yeah, so the question was, once we have established sort of the main line of the train, do we plan on finding ways to bring people from suburbs and less of the central city area to these main stations? And yes, we do. One of our plans was to consult with the different like suburban communities and the community leaders to see. Our proposed plan would be free transport to the stations in hydrogen-powered buses, which would hopefully have a lower, well, it would have a low carbon impact due to the fact that it's run on hydrogen, and would also provide better access for people in the suburbs by not making them pay more.
Can I add something? Also, if you're also wondering about the nearby vicinity, this is mostly for like inner city and outer city travel. If you're talking about more smaller cities, not like like I don't know,
Hartford to Providence.
yeah, that we were also thinking of a proposal to not use bullet trains, because bullet trains, they usually have to travel in straight lines, little stops. So we could also use a high-speed regular train that uses electricity, since, you know what Austin said, most localities are expecting to transition into renewables. We can see that these high-speed normal trains can take you from smaller cities to other smaller cities to the bigger cities, so you can take the larger bullet train.
Any other questions?
I might have one more quick one, but since you are like a lobbying group and that is kind of the focus, is there any specific sort of programs that you would like to plan or work with the government to plan to maybe incentivize consumers to maybe turn in their cars, or completely get rid of cars to try and rely specifically on your train if they stay in that metropolitan area?
All right. Yeah.
So the question is because we're a lobbying group, are we gonna like find like institute programs or anything to like help incentivize the train, or like incentivize people to like turn in their cars or whatever? I think this would definitely be something where we would work with like the local communities and local climate activists to see like if they had any suggestions, and to see what they think would work best in their communities, because there are obviously going to be some cities and some areas where people are, if we just go in and say, oh, everybody turn in your car, then you can ride the train for free, that might like exclude some areas of people where they absolutely need their cars, like a spouse works somewhere down the street, or like they have an elderly like relative that they have to take to the hospital. So like obviously I think that would be more on a community basis, and then we can see where there's similarities between communities and then try and make a more national and broad expanding plan. I think the like turning in a car incentivizing thing would be good, or even like increasing maybe gas prices, because if gas prices go up, then it would make the train look more favorable. But overall, I think it would be more like talking with communities and local stakeholders to see what they think would be beneficial. I think Renee was going to add something. Sorry.
Yeah,
Oh, no, you're fine. You're fine.
What would be your strongest selling point when applying for public government funding, and how would your solution stand out as compared to other transportation solutions, like maybe just buses?
So the question was what angle we would take to present this to the broader public, I believe. And the second part of that question was, how would this be a better option than like buses, for example, and maybe like Amtrak also. So I'll take that in reverse order. So I think it would be better than buses or Amtrak because it'd be quicker and faster. And I think we're trying to make it so that the tickets are cheaper than Amtrak, maybe just slightly, but I mean, cheaper is cheaper. And then the last question, the angle we would take, I think we have to have a aggressive ad campaign and really push lawmakers to see. I think the biggest part is the private donations from like-minded individuals, because there's a lot of capital out there for more green technology and investment from philanthropers and individuals like that and organizations like that. Yeah.
Also, the reason why we didn't choose, for example, electric buses is that even though they're electric and they don't emit gases, CO2, stuff like that, they still consume rubber for their tires, grease for their axles, engine oil, or any type of lubricant. And those, if not managed correctly, they can still end up in the, out in the wilderness. And I would say they even cause a greater danger to the environment around them than actual CO2. So that's why we consider the bullet train route, because it is a more concise, simple solution.
Yeah, and Lori just wanted to add that there is an electric train called the Amtrak Acela. Did you guys come across that at all? I think it's in the Northeast.
Yeah, I believe so.
So, and the current problem with, so he mentioned that there is an existing train in the Northeast called the Acela, which I have ridden before, and it takes 4 hours to get from Boston to New York on that train. That's primarily because the tracks that the train runs on, even though the train is capable of going high speeds, it can't because the tracks aren't up to the standard that could be that it could go those speeds realistically. The tracks also go through a lot of urban areas and highly dense areas where it's just not safe for the train to go that fast. So that's why we would have to improve these tracks, do some rerouting to make sure that these bullet trains can actually reach their full speed potential.
Lastly, on that point, the main impetus to this proposal was actually that train, because as Mike was saying, it's slow, it goes through neighborhoods, it can't go at full speed. So we wanted to create a train in an area in which it could go full speed, relatively full speed, and it would only stop in the major minor city areas, as opposed to like neighborhoods.
Great. Awesome, guys.
Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Hi everyone, my name is Riley.
My name is Nick.
I'm Weber.
I'm Natalie.
And I'm Amanda.
And our project is From Dust to Daffodils, Sustainable Soil Reclamation. Our project is focused on reclaiming eroded soil to promote future food security and land stewardship. We want to do this in a community-focused, sustainable way.
So our golden circle focuses on why we're doing this, how we're doing it, and what we're doing it for. So for why, we have a little fact that U.S. farms are currently losing twice as much topsoil to erosion per year as the Great Plains lost at the height of the 1930s Dust Bowl. So obviously this is a very important topic. Soil is the basis of our ecosystem. It's very critical for food production and a lot of important subjects, so it's important to protect it for future generations. as we know, natural disasters are becoming more and more common, such as dust storms and extreme floods. So it's important to have soil that can withstand these events. And soil is also critical in lessening algae blooms that happen as a result from eutrophication, where nutrients run off into water. So what we are doing is creating a sustainably powered greenhouse. And within the greenhouse, we're going to be germinating plants that support soil reclamation and fertilization. And this could be implemented in places that will benefit the most ecologically, socially, and economically.
Yeah, for how, obviously, we all know that plants need heat and lighting. So for our heat, we'll be using geothermal to heat the greenhouse. And the greenhouse will be built from photovoltaic, or semi-transparent photovoltaic, which is semi-transparent solar cells, to help generate the electricity needed for lighting and to power the heat pump for the geothermal. We'll also be working closely with the communities that require replenishing of their soil, and we potentially would like to also educate these communities so that they would prevent this from happening in the future due to over-farming. And finally, for funding, we will most likely be getting it from private sources and government programs and grants.
So the Sustainable Development Goals we are targeting include zero hunger, as we're working to create more farmland for people to grow their own food on, affordable and clean energy with the solar and geothermal, which we'll talk about a little bit later, reduced inequalities. Most of these community partners will be coming from the lower socioeconomic levels, so we'll be working with them very closely to find solutions that will help them improve their situation. Climate action, again promoting clean energy, but also giving communities the availability to produce their own food locally, which cuts down on transportation and also plastic use for packaging for food. And finally, life on land, we're restoring soil that has been depleted by overuse and erosion. So for our sustainability complex, we will be targeting the community. We'll be working closely with communities to find the best solution for them, taking a very individualized approach, but we will be seeking funding from the city, state, and national levels.
So Recare Hub is an organization that already exists, and it takes place in Europe, where a group of 27 different organizations came together to assess soil threats and to help further prevent soil degradation. So they've done case studies in multiple locations throughout Europe, but what better place to focus our case study on than the country we are currently in? So this took place in Gunnarsholt, Iceland, and their focus was on soil erosion by wind because, as we know, Iceland is very windy. The soil is classified as andisols because it comes from a volcanic origin, and therefore it's very unstable and fragile to the elements such as wind and water erosion, land degradation, and desertification. So in the early 20th century, they began planting limegrass and grass seed to help reclaim the soil. And as we learned in the lecture, lupin was also widely used throughout Iceland. However, it is invasive, so for our project, we'd rather focus more on native species that won't disturb the ecosystem. And today, they plant a lot of woody vegetation, such as native birch and willow, because it helps stabilize the land from volcanic ash deposition, because this area is close to Mount Hekla.
So, using what we learned in Iceland, we would bring more soil reclamation to the United States. We would start with a case study in Elkhart, Kansas. This city was in the center of the 1930s Dust Bowl and faces both wind and water erosion. We would use diverse plants and flowers, starting the process in a greenhouse so we can germinate the seeds. We are aiming for about 20 to 50 native species so the ecosystem can be diverse and stronger. We would also try alley cropping, which is where you have wide rows of trees, and in between those you have multiple crops. This increases the yield, and the trees provide a windbreak. We will also focus on things like cover crops, nitrogen fixation, perennials, which are plants that last at least 2 to 3 years, not plowing the land, and future crop rotation. These are some photos of the plants that are native to Kansas. The top row are grasses that would act as cover so we can ground the dry soil that is currently there. And the bottom row are flowers that are known for helping to get nitrogen back into the dirt to make healthier soil.
Going a little more in depth with the heat source, like as we mentioned earlier, we're using geothermal. However, unlike the geothermal power plants that we learned here, we aren't really going to be collecting any steam to like produce electricity or to warm the water. Instead, it's going to be a very simple system. Ground source heat pump, or GSHP for short, is a very simple closed loop system that goes about 20 to 30 feet underground. And interesting enough, the temperature in this region is held constant to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So the fluid-filled tubes will essentially be circulated underground to either be heated or cooled down. And the fluid we'll be using would most likely just be water mixed with antifreeze, so that we'll be avoiding any complications during the colder winter days. And just a quick overview, like we all know, heat flows from a high body or high temperature body or fluid to a low one, which is essential or crucial to understanding how the system works. And yeah, so the main reason we're going to be using thermal is so that we can maintain a constant temperature. During the day, we would like to keep it around 21 to 27 degrees Celsius, and at night, just above 10 to 13 degrees Celsius. So applying the simple heat flow concept that we talked about, this is a simple diagram over here. And as you can see, during the winter days or cold nights, the air above ground would obviously be colder than the air or whatever is below ground. So the fluid would circulate in the system, and the cold air above would cool down the fluid. And as it travels down, the heat would heat up the fluid inside the tube, and this heated fluid would then be brought up back into the heat pump here. So yeah, the heated fluid will then travel back into the heat pump, and the heat pump compresses the liquid, which further increases the temperature, and the warmed air would then be exchanged with cooler air, and the cooled liquid will be pumped back down into the ground, closing off the system. And obviously, during the extremely hot days, this process would just be reversed. The heat above ground will be hotter than what's underneath. So just going over why we went with geothermal. As we talked about, it is very good for the environment. There's very low environmental impacts, very low carbon emission. We also found that it is highly efficient with a constant coefficient of performance of about 3 to 5, which essentially means every 1 unit of energy we input, we will get 3 to 5 times the amount of energy out, which in this case will be in the form of heat. It is also not weather dependent, as we talked about. It is underground, so if it was snowing or raining, it wouldn't really affect the performance of our system. And it's also very reliable. Today's geothermal systems are built to last about 25 to 50 years. And in addition, as we saw from the previous diagram, there's very little moving parts, so there's not much maintenance required. However, there are a few cons. It is quite expensive. We'll go more into that for the cost analysis, but there's a very high upfront cost, and as we did talk about, it is underground, so if any tubes were to break or anything, it would be very difficult and costly to repair.
We'll also be using semi-transparent organic solar cells to generate some of the power for the greenhouse. They are different in 2 major ways based on the name from the traditional. First of all, it's semi-transparent, so it allows some of the light to go through. And it's also organic as opposed to the traditional silicon and organic solar cells. The module that we picked has an average visual transmittance of 90% and a power conversion efficiency of 3.7%. It's a very new technology, so there really wasn't pricing available for it. And the cell we picked was also a super straight cell. So the diagram on the right would actually be flipped, and the glass substrate's on the top for the incident radiation coming through it. For the case study in Kansas, this is the solar analysis we did. The location had 4.86 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day of global horizontal incident radiation. And using the calculated 316 meters squared of roof space, we found the incident radiation to be 1,536 kilowatt hours a day. So for our greenhouse design, we used a 30-foot by 96-foot, which is actually the commercial standard for greenhouses, the most common. The roof pitch we used was 32 degrees, just based on the latitude. We wanted to maximize the radiation going into the panels. As I previously said, 316 meters squared of roof space. So it needed a total of 63,000 to 238,000 kilowatt hours per year to power this entire thing. And the total energy produced by these panels that we picked was a little under 21,000 kilowatt hours per year. So based on that, we could figure out that it was 8.7 to 33% of the total electricity consumption was generated from the solar panels. And based off of the Kansas pricing of electricity, that's a little under $2,700 a year.
All right, so to talk about some money, we are seeking funding from both government and private sources. Here are just some examples of some government sources that we could look at. There are some that are nationwide from the USDA. There are some that are specific to Kansas. And there's just a variety of grants that we would be able to pursue for some funding. For private funding, there's a very interesting concert that goes on every year called Farm Aid. Basically, a bunch of country singers get together and sing songs and gain funding for local family farms to protect family farming and to help protect their livelihoods. So we would really love to partner with things like Farm Aid, country singers, other celebrities who would like to support our mission. So for the social business model, I know there's a lot here, but just the key points, the resources, we need building supplies, we need the technology, and we need somewhere to build it. Our partners include our funding sources, the community members that we're going to work very closely with, and potentially some research labs or universities to provide us the solar panels and test out this new solar technology. Our key activities, management of the greenhouse, communication with communities, and just like we did the other day, planting and fertilizing these these plants for the fields. Type of intervention, we would work directly with the communities and continue to support and educate them throughout the process. As I said, the channels would be very direct interaction, go to presentations, go to where the people are who need help, and we would have an educational online presence. We would be helping the local farmers and the local communities and getting the payment from the private and public funding. And we would be giving value to these areas because we're restoring farmland for food production, which would increase their economic ability. We would also reduce erosion, which, like Natalie said, which would reduce things like flooding and landslides and things like that, so natural disaster reduction. And we would measure our success by how much land is planted at first, and then later down the road, we would measure how much land becomes available for farming.
So our estimated startup cost was about $135,000. Our surplus we're a nonprofit, so basically any excess funding would be used for future greenhouses if the pilot ends up being successful. And then our revenue would be local, state, and federal government subsidies, hopefully. Another interesting idea was hopefully getting lab donations of the panels because they're still in the research stages. So it would be good PR for the laboratories that are creating these panels, and we'd be able to use them hopefully for free. We want to make sure we're paying our employees a livable wage and hopefully create a little bit of a volunteering network possibly in the local community and also keep the cost minimal for the community partners.
So our project is feasible with funding. It just depends if the government wants to allocate money towards soil reclamation. There are trade-offs with our solar technology, but overall the project is possible.
Yeah, just to summarize, we are designing a very efficient and sustainably powered greenhouse. As we talked about, we'll be using geothermal and the solar panels. And we're also just germinating the native plants and to promote the soil reclamation and fertilization.
And we want to have continued support and collaboration with local communities in order to restore farmland.
Thank you so much. Here's our references. And thank you to Shelley. Any questions?
Great. Does anybody have any questions here in the audience?
Have you heard of anywhere in the U.S. doing something similar?
Repeat the question.
Okay, the question was if we've heard of anywhere in the U.S. That are doing projects similar to this. Not specifically. They know it is a problem, and it's being taken upon like some schools and universities who are aware of this. As far as organizations, I'm sure there are some out there, but ours would be one that uses the process like starting in a greenhouse and then working closely like with widespread communities. The question was how many employees or staff are we expected to have in this setup? We're hoping for probably like at least a dozen, maybe less, full-time employees to monitor it full-time, and they'll kind of have the knowledge like from start to finish of how it's running. We're also hoping for volunteers, students who can get credit for this, and other people that are interested in wanting to help out.
Have you considered using your pilot greenhouses, maybe an education center to kind of teach people about like the geothermal heat pumps, the new solar technology, and then also like greenhouse farming to kind of and the soil restoration concept like we saw at pre-camera maybe?
Yep.
Sure.
Yeah, so the question was, would we consider using this pilot greenhouse as sort of an educational center, like the one that we were able to visit earlier this week? And the answer is absolutely. We would, education and community outreach is at the core of this project, to make sure that the benefits are really planted, no pun intended, in the community itself. So to begin with, as we're building up, the educational online presence would definitely be very important so that the entire community would know what we're doing. And if we had the resources available, we would love to do like a little museum slash exhibit. We would love to, like Riley was saying, have school students help us just like we did fertilize the plants. So we would, that would be a main aspect if we had the resources too, would be education.
So with the seeds and the planting, would you like use any sort of like artificial fertilizer or anything like that? Or, and if you did, would it be like organic type stuff, or like how would you go about using it?
Do you want?
So the question is, would we need to use any fertilizers, and if so, would they be organic? Our goal is to not use fertilizers within the first year, so that way the roots can get strong on their own. And then from there, if they need like supplemental help, we would try to go as organic and natural as possible. The purpose of the like 20 to 50 like plant species is so the ecosystem is strong on its own. If some species and plants fail, there are still others that will be able to keep the soil grounded, and the system will the plants will work with themselves.
Any other questions from the live audience? Okay, so Lori asked, what challenges can you foresee in the first year of starting this venture pilot?
Well, the question was, what challenges do we foresee in the first year? I mean, funding is obviously the biggest one. Just finding good sources of funding and people that will pay for part of this project. And also the volunteer network would be, I think, a little bit difficult to get started up, but after that, I think it should be able to run pretty smoothly.
Maybe going off that, then, how do you think you could sort of sell yourself to these funding agencies, like the USDA or the government?
The question was, how will we sell ourselves to the funding agencies? If we can pair with a lab first and then show that we're trying to use new technology, I think that would go very far, because it shows that we're like a step ahead of everyone else who was trying to create these type of greenhouses and using technology that's just new and hasn't been out in the world very often. Then yeah, hopefully they'll see that ours is different than from everyone else's greenhouses, and hopefully get more funding for us.
Any other questions, feedback, comments? No? Then let's give them a round of applause. Good job, guys. Great maybe try to stay on like that side of the screen if you can, and just rotate.
Good afternoon, everybody. We are here to introduce our project CarbCap, a modular CCU technology for developing nation infrastructure. And as an introduction, my name is Elizabeth Luna. I'm an incoming software engineer with Emergent Space Technologies at NASA.
I'm Julian Magdalensky. I'm an incoming senior studying chemistry at UC Berkeley.
Hi, I'm Raven Shalander. I'm a senior in chemical engineering at the University of Michigan.
Hi, I'm Savannah. I have a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of North Florida and currently work as a distribution engineer at Georgia Power.
Hello, I'm Maya Puffer. I'm a rising sophomore at Tufts University studying international relations and environmental studies.
So the problem at hand. While developing countries do not have access to the many luxuries that industrialized countries have when it comes to renewable energy, our goal is to allow these countries to utilize strategic fossil fuel resources such as coal and gas for their industrialization process, while still being able to ultimately reduce and eliminate the carbon dioxide generated from these power plants to prevent further damage to our climate. And this is just a graph showing the comparison between developed and undeveloped countries in their contribution to climate change as well as their wealth. So you can see in the blue, we got the developed countries such as the US and also the EU. And yellow, we have like countries like China and India. So for our why, so while these countries are transitioning to renewable energy, they will also need to be able to keep up with energy demands, which would also necessitate using some type of modular technology in order to reduce those emissions. And this kind of technology would be used in countries in Africa, in some regions in Latin America, but in particular for our project, we are focusing on India for its diversified new renewable investments portfolio.
So how we would achieve this is through the support of the UN in receiving some domestic investments, but a majority of financial support will come from developed nations with records of producing a majority of the CO2 emissions on a global scale.
And then, so the what of our project is modular CO2 absorbent units, which we could retrofit pre-existing coal power plants with, that would be powered entirely by renewable energy, solar energy. And then we could take this sequestered CO2 and sell it back to consumers to get a profit from that.
So for our sustainability complex, initially we would focus it on local, regional areas. In particular, we have Vindhyachal, Madhya Pradesh, India. Sorry if I butchered that. But in the future, as our project would get more support, hopefully to expand it on a national level with global support financially and through commerce. And for the Sustainable Development Goals, we identified it for SDG number 9 for industry innovation infrastructure for our project's ability to facilitate sustainable infrastructure development in least developed countries. We also have SDG number 12 for the responsible consumption and production, and so for our project's ability to support developing countries and strengthening its technological capacity for more sustainable consumption and production. And finally, for SDG number 17 for our project will necessitate global support in order to meet the outlined SDG targets.
So when we're looking at the Indian government's specific stance on renewables, they have made a lot of promises in the past and not totally met them. So they have promised to retire their coal plants older than 25 years by 2027, but an important caveat to note here is that 2/3 of their coal power plants are less than 10 years old. They have also promised at COP26 to have half of their energy be from renewable sources by 2030 and be at a net zero by 2070. But at the same time, they're looking to increase their coal capacity by 2030. If we look at this graph, we can see that they're still getting about 70% of their energy from coal, despite their benchmark by 2030 being around 10%. So we can see that it's very unrealistic to ask India to cut off their coal completely, and they simply won't. There are also 4 million people that are employed by and dependent on these coal plants, and they clearly won't be reaching their benchmark anytime soon, which is why we're bringing this technology, so that we're not asking them to completely cut off this important power source, but maybe we can reduce the emissions from it. So how will we make this work? Public support is crucial for a large-scale project like this one. Not only are we looking for support from government, including both the Indian government itself and foreign assistance, but from civilians in both India and developed nations to back this development. They will be key in pushing governments to act and invest in these crucial technologies. In order to get the grants for these projects, we are primarily looking towards developed nations. We are relying on their buy-in so that we can begin with a pilot installment. This will hopefully help to show the profitability of the technology and gain more traction surrounding it. This can help then make it more widespread. And in the future, once India's economy is more stabilized in the energy department, we hope that they can continue to make efforts on this front on their own. But for now, they will continue some of their efforts towards investing in renewable energy and trying to diminish the impact of the massive amounts of coal already developed or in the pipeline. And again, if we're looking at the stakeholders, as I've already mentioned, we're looking to get a lot of investments and grants from foreign nations to some sort of UN fund or consortium, which will lead to an installment of a pilot design, and this development and resale of CO2 back to the developed nations that helped with the investment. Again, we're not expecting much of an investment from the Indian government itself, but their cooperation is crucial, and we'll also be working with diplomats from the US and the UN to communicate and help with governmental appeal.
Great. So the adsorbents that we're using in this modularized CO2 capture plant addition is a little bit different than the traditional ones used. So commonly used absorbents such as zeolites or porous carbon are very mature in the field and their cost is low. However, they suffer from a few fatal flaws, one of which being that the presence of moisture in flue gas can degrade those very easily, those absorbents. And so here we propose using a relatively novel material called metal organic frameworks. And basically that just consists of metal nodes linked by organic linkers. So you get sort of a cage like a jungle gym. And these are incredibly porous. They have very high surface areas. A gram of a typical MOF, if spread out atomically thin, would cover a football field. So that's just a little pile of salt or something on your fingertip. And so the way we make these is relatively simple and straightforward, a very cheap and easy process. You basically take an organic linker, such as 2,5-dihydroxy terephthalic acid, and mix it with a metal source, and in this case, magnesium nitrate hexahydrate. And so that creates the MOF that we focused on, which is magnesium MOF 74. And the way that these actually absorb CO2 is you pass gas through them, through the pores, and non-polar gases with no dipole, like nitrogen or oxygen, pass right through, whereas molecules like CO2 can actually bind, and then we can reversibly remove these later.
So how are we then going to use MOF 74 in our process? Well, overall, the power plant that we're choosing to work with, Vindhyakal, produces up to 42 million metric tons of CO2 per year. And a lot of that comes from one of their newest add-ons, Unit 13 at that plant. So that's where we're going to be focusing our pilot carbon capture unit. With the amount of CO2 that releases, that roughly equates to about 600 kilograms of MOF required for 100% carbon removal from that unit of the plant. So essentially, we'll be designing a carb cap modular unit that will be a compartment similar to a scrubbing system, which you can see in like the lower left-hand corner there, that are usually implemented in existing coal plants. Those are really used for desulfurization processes, and NTPC, which is basically like the national energy company within India, as well as General Electric from the US. They've already implemented units like that on power plants, so we know that retrofitting this kind of technology is pretty feasible. So essentially our module unit, flue gas will be run through the prior scrubbing system, and then it will enter our unit until the MOF is fully saturated with CO2. Then what we're going to do is we're going to use a fluid thermal heating system, and essentially we're going to heat up our metal organic framework and then run a vacuum through it so we can kind of desorb the CO2 and put it in storage tanks later to deliver to other facilities, such as like carbon curing or many other industries that we'll get into later. So going on then, the key activities and resources required for this process, obviously it's going to be, pretty high startup costs as we actually implement this technology into the plant and retrofit it to the existing technology. So we're going to need grants for the carb cap startup to design and create and then also transport it to India. We're also going to work with existing manufacturers on purchasing solar panels as well, and use subcontractors within India so that way we can build a solar farm to completely power this technology 100% renewably with solar power. We are also going to hire and train some technicians within India so that way we can, create some jobs within that market as well. And that way we can work with our engineers and our organization to make sure the equipment is running as efficiently and as smoothly as possible so there are no issues. Again, our resources over to the side, grants from organizations like the National Science Foundation, as well as the collective investment portfolio managed by the UN. That will act as like a feeder for finances for the initial high startup costs, as well as for regular maintenance. And we also expect to see lots of backing from the UN and public support within the area as well. So for the cost breakdown, you might look at that and be like, whoa, large numbers right away. Well, that's because, there's a lot that goes into it. So to scrub approximately 42 million metric tons of CO2, we would need to efficiently cycle about 5,000 kilograms altogether of the moth every day. So that would come out to an initial investment of just around $250,000, but then the housing is the real main kicker. If we look at previous investments into scrubbing systems into these coal plants, they can get quite pricey, but they can also be made more efficient with further testing, and this can decrease the price much more in the future as well. The cost of maintenance, operating labor, et cetera, would probably be about like 10% of that unit, so about 11 million. And then in terms of the solar farm, because solar energy has actually become much more efficient and much cheaper as it's been researched over the past decade or so, that's actually going to be one of the cheaper parts of our technology here. So what can we do to decrease these costs?
Thanks. So metal organic frameworks are a relatively new emerging field of chemistry, but as you can see from the 70s onward, you can see a very exponential growth in crystal structures reported, which is just like new MOFs being discovered. And that really owes to the very high tunability and customizability of the different organic linkers and metal centers you can choose. So it's thought that, with lots of innovation in that respect, chemical and thermal stability will increase and costs will inevitably decrease as well. And so speaking of innovation, solar is one of the rapidly decelerating costing energy sources. In the past 10 years, we've seen solar prices drop by about a fifth. And it's expected that in the next 10 years, they will drop even further by half. So solar has really beat all expectations in terms of feasibility and implementation. And so it's likely that although our initial costs are high now, in 10 years' time, this project might be much more feasible from an economic standpoint.
So instead of injecting the carbon into the earth, we will actually be selling it to companies with an existing demand for carbon dioxide in various products. There's different examples of these in each of the areas on the flowchart. However, our main concern will be on the manufacturing and industrial side, using it in curing and reinforcing concrete.
Yeah, so just a quick example of how this can be done. There's lots of research being done, and many companies are already curing cement with CO2 to create stronger composites that are more valuable, more eco-friendly, and stronger overall. So it's a win-win in every scenario. So in fact, researchers from Saudi company Aramco, as well as like the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, have already been implementing this technology. So this concrete may be sent back to the countries that initially invested in this technology. as it is more valuable than traditional steam-only cured cement. However, it could also be sold to local construction companies as well, because it's a lot more valuable and more resistant to natural disasters, etc. Or it could also be sold to local consumers and natives from the area, so that way they could have CO2 captured driveways or roadways or whatever they would like in their community that would be more resistant to weather and also cool because they're saving the environment 1 kilogram of CO2 at a time.
Yeah, just to add briefly to that, that is likely an emerging market that we will see. It'll probably start as an industrial process, the curing of concrete, but we could see the commodity niche kind of market emerge from this green concrete as more people are wanting to lessen or remove their carbon footprint.
So our primary benefits are focused on both global and local environmental impacts by reducing overall emissions as well as improving air quality for the communities surrounding the plant. We will also for increase public image for the organizations involved, possibly leading to increased profit or funding. For the customers, we will be selling this idea to developing countries or developed countries, and in turn, we will who will be fronting a majority of the cost, and in return, they will receive the carbon as a product. Setbacks we expect to run into include opposition from the Indian government while trying to convince them to implement this technology, especially considering their heavy reliance on coal. Also, we expect it to be somewhat of a hard sell to the developed countries that will be footing the bill, who may want to use that funding instead to invest that money into reducing carbon emissions in their own countries.
And this is just a recap of our business model. And so, yeah, we'll gladly take any questions at this point. Yeah.
Given that your organization is going to be a foreign country going into India to do this work, is there anything that you're going to do to work on the social acceptability of it?
Maya, do you want to answer about social acceptability?
Yeah, the question was about social acceptability by going into a country like India. I talked a lot about how there is a lot of dependence on coal, especially from neighboring communities, not only in jobs, but in resource. So by implementing this technology, we are hoping to increase the job market and work with the community to hopefully work on on public appeal. It's definitely, it will be a hard sell. But I think by reducing the emissions in the area and hopefully reducing pollution, local communities will support it.
Also, even though it's a US-based company, we will be using contractors and workers from that nation to build the plant, build the solar farm, and then do maintenance on it. So it is increasing, job opportunities for the people who live in the community surrounding the plant.
Yeah, so the question was whether we've looked into any other universities or companies within India who are already currently working with carbon capture or renewable energy. We haven't been able to find many so far in our research. However, at the plant that we are looking at retrofitting our equipment in, They have already taken steps to implement hydropower as well as solar power. I believe during our research on this plant in particular, I think it was about 15 megawatts of energy comes from hydropower from nearby streams in the community, and about 8 megawatts of the power comes from, a few solar panels that they've installed, just to kind of like show the Indian government that they're trying to reach those renewable goals that they set forth in their policies. However, obviously 15 plus 8, 23 megawatts out of it's a 4,700 megawatt plant. That's obviously not enough to, really reduce their carbon footprint as much as they can. So we'll probably build on existing technologies and partnerships that they've used to get that technology implemented, and really just try to work with the local communities and companies as much as we can.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, that would be a great place to start, actually, is in the local communities where there might be research being done on ways to do this sort of work, because, again, for the social acceptance, getting the people of India, the citizens behind this, will help push forward the policies and the other things that we really need to get this kind of ball rolling. So it's not something neo-colonialist like us coming in, and that again is a good concern. So thanks.
Kind of to piggyback a little bit on what that most recent question was, do you think there would be other countries that would want to partner with the U.S. and working with India?
Yeah. So the question was, would there be other countries that would want to partner with the U.S.? And so most definitely, there are other countries that should partner with the U.S. For example, a lot of the European Union and Russia and other countries that have paved the way for their industrialization process by burning tons of coal, they sort of do have a moral, ethical responsibility to not just say to developing countries, now that we realize how negative CO2 is for the climate, say, hey, you can't use coal, you can't use fossil fuels, you have to start from renewables. And so that's, again, sort of the point of our capstone, is to allow these countries the flexibility to use the cheaper fossil fuel alternatives to renewable energies, but just mitigate the damage done. So definitely other countries in the European Union, would definitely be good to partner with the US for this.
So with your solar farm component, would the energy from solar be used to create your modular system or to run it? Like how specifically would that energy be used?
Yeah, so the question was, how would the energy from the solar farm be used in the process of running the adsorbent modular units? And so basically the solar energy is there to defeat sort of the main problem that these carbon sequestration efforts have had previously, which is the parasitic energy cost, which means the energy you're diverting from the coal plant to power the processes like the removal of CO2 from the adsorbent when it's saturated. So as much as 40% of the coal plant's energy actually normally goes to desorbing the CO2 captured, and so that's a huge amount of energy that is used up. And so the idea of using solar as opposed to other renewable energies like geothermal is that once the initial cost is in there, there is basically an unlimited source of free energy day after day, and so we don't have to run into that issue of diverting part of the energy from the coal plant to power the desorbent. So yeah, the way that the energy is used is basically in the heating of the absorbent and pulling vacuum on it to actually remove the CO2 from it once it's bound.
Would your carbon capture only work for coal, or would it work for gas plants as well?
Yeah, so the question is, would the carbon capture only work for coal, or would it work for gas plants in addition? And the answer is yes, it would work for gas. The composition is a little different, but it's not so much. There's a little less CO2. In flue gas, it's around 15%, and in natural gas, I believe it's around 10 to 11%, but that's not a huge difference in terms of these MOF's selectivities for carbon dioxide uptake. So yeah, it would work just as well for natural gas or other kinds of fossil fuel plants.
Yeah, there's a question from Lori. He asked, do you think the scale of your proposed project would hinder getting it off the ground? If so, what would be the smallest
Yeah. Yeah. So, does someone else want to take that? I mean, I can feel free to. Okay. Sorry. The question was, do you think that the scale of this might be preventative in terms of getting this project like up and going? I think that this is kind of a happy medium where there are very small scale, like lab scale experiments that are run on carbon capture. There are smaller scale power plants we could try and implement this on. I think one reason why we chose to use the Vindiachal, sorry again if I'm mispronouncing that, power plant is that if we can make a substantial dent in the carbon dioxide emitted from this plant, that would be significant for a number of reasons. The power station that we talked about here is the 9th largest in the world, and in 2018, it was the second highest emitter of carbon dioxide from any other power plants. So that owes to the sort of inefficient methods in which carbon dioxide is scrubbed or other gases are. And so I think by tackling just one unit of this power plant, it could kind of help set the precedent. So like aiming high is hard at the beginning, but if we can do it, it really kind of paves the way for future substantial innovations in this field.
Any other questions from the audience? Cool, then. Thanks, guys. So I just want to quickly say thank you to everyone here at Midgard that has listened in, asked thoughtful questions, and paid attention to these presentations, as well as all the viewers online. You guys have clearly put a lot of hard work and thought into each and every one of your capstones. I'm really proud to have learned from you, and I've learned a lot, I know, and I'm hoping that everyone who's gotten to see these presentations and will see them in the future will also share that. So I just wanted to say you guys should be very proud of yourselves. Give yourselves a pat on the back. Congratulate yourselves for taking these steps to become, the next generation of renewable energy and, climate innovation specialists. So yeah, congrats, guys.